We probably all know someone who will do anything for anyone. They're full of kindness, they're full of love, but it's for other people, not for themselves. And they can show the most incredible levels of kindness and love and help and support for lots and lots of people. But when they actually start to think of it for themselves, quite often it can be a very uncomfortable feeling, maybe even traumatic, something that they're just not comfortable doing. And they have real problems showing any kind of self-compassion or self-love for themselves. And a question I've got for you is, how much of that do you recognise in yourself? How much do you recognise that when you try to show any kind of well-being, self-love, self-compassion, any sort of support for yourself, it can actually feel a bit awkward. Well, awkward at the least, very uncomfortable, and maybe even too emotional to even touch. In this video, we're going to look at a bit of that, how it can impact us and so on, and later on look at some of the tools and techniques that we can use to actually help us. The impact that the inability to show yourself any sort of self-compassion, self-love, self-kindness, the impact that that can have on us is immense. It can be an emotional one, it can be a physical one, and it can affect our relationships as well. And that stops us getting the best of what we can get out of our own lives. It stops us living our best life. And for a lot of people, it can actually feel wrong or selfish to even start thinking about themselves. Now, a lot of us have been brought up that we should be thinking of other people and that anything else is, well, really, that's just a bit selfish and we've got to think of other folk, you know. The way we might notice it, sometimes other people might notice it actually before we do, which is more likely, is things like negative self-talk, where we are constantly putting ourselves down. Oh, that's not for the likes of me. I can't do that. You know what I'm like when it comes to DIY. You know, the funny thing is, some of these things are exactly the things I've said, particularly with DIY. We say these things, they're a wee bit of a defensive mechanism, but equally they're putting us down. And the more that we say that, oh, I can't do that, the more we actually believe we can't do that. So that negative self-talk is one of the first things that we can start to check in. Either noticing it in yourself, even asking a friend or a relative to point out now and again that when you start saying something like, oh, you know what I'm like, or that's not for me, or I'm useless at that kind of thing, to actually point it out to you. And the funny thing is, you'll start realising yourself pretty quickly. You'll start hearing it in yourself. Now, it doesn't mean to say you'll stop saying it altogether. Very few people do. And sometimes it is just meant as a joke, and that's fine. But it's when it gets said too often that that's the big problem. That's when we start having problems and we start really believing that we're no use at something. So these things like negative self-talk, putting ourselves down, they effectively are barriers towards us showing any sort of kindness or compassion to ourselves. And if this sounds a bit like self-sabotage, it's because it can lead into that. It can lead into us putting ourselves down so much that we end up not doing things, that we don't believe we can do things, and getting in our own way. And when that happens, it's quite easy for us to therefore settle for less. And it's that settling for less that can cause a lot of unhappiness and dissatisfaction, because when we're doing that, we don't even notice some of the things we're doing. Most of the times we don't even notice what we're doing. But maybe using a bit of mindfulness to help with that sort of thing, maybe use a bit of journaling to reflect on your day, start to notice what you've done. And it doesn't necessarily have to be at that moment. You know, it's perfectly okay to look back on something and say, right, today I felt a bit uncomfortable because it's not really what I wanted to do. You know, I'm not the only one who can make a cup of tea at work. When you start to reflect at the end of the day, it's perfectly okay. So using mindfulness, a bit of reflection, a bit of journaling so that you can start to get a focus around it. And from that, you can start to work out boundaries for yourself. Boundaries are a great thing. Very, very difficult to start sometimes for some people. That thought that you're going to say no to something, but it's not always a case of outright saying no. Sometimes it can be a case of wording it in a different way so that it's more a case of, here are some options. I'm not able to do this just now. Maybe you could take it, maybe it could wait till later on, so that you're not rushing away, leaving your work or leaving what you're wanting to do. Change it, rather than just saying no, work out ways, and this is what you can do during that reflection part, work out how you might approach saying these things. So that helps to build and strengthen your way of overcoming these barriers to self-love and self-compassion. Reframing what you are thinking or saying, recognizing that some of the things we say can be quite negative. And an example of reframing might be something like, instead of always saying, oh, I only do this, I only do that, start thinking to yourself and start saying to others, well, actually I do this, I do that, I'm quite good at this. Oh, there's a difficult one to do. Admit that you're actually quite good at something, but start with something easy for yourself, you know, maybe even say it into yourself a few times. You'll start to believe it eventually. Tell yourself that you're actually good at something. Reframe it. Not just, it can't be that hard if I can do it. It's such classic negative self-talk or negative framing. And it took me a wee while to actually recognise that I was saying that. You know, I just thought it was a bit of a joke. And quite often we do think that it's just a joke. We don't realise that we're actually programming ourselves to be quite down on ourselves. Now the biggie. How do we start to cultivate self-love? And that is a difficult one, especially if we've spent a long time not actually believing in ourselves too much. One of the classic ways, and you'll hear this, it comes from positive psychology, and it's called gratitude journaling. The science is there, the research is there to show that it does work, and it works very, very well. I've given people examples of this in the past, and quite often I'll get at least somebody in a group saying, I'm not comfortable with the word gratitude, who am I to be grateful for anything? And I thought a little bit about this, and then I started suggesting, instead of doing a gratitude journal, think of it as wins. What have my wins been of the day? And we started looking at things like the 3 wins, because the classic gratitude journal is, what 3 things can you be grateful for today? It is surprising how many people don't feel comfortable with dealing with gratitude. And fine, instead of a coach or psychologist, a therapist going, well, you need to be comfortable, you need to do it because that's what it is, then we can adjust it slightly for that person. And starting to think of it as, what 3 wins have you had today, is a lot more comfortable for a lot of people. Journaling is the classic way of either doing 3 wins or 3 points of gratitude or anything like that. And the classic way of doing that is to write it down in a book. But not everybody's comfortable with that. Some people have a worry that other people will read it, that the privacy might not be there. They might just not, it might just not be the way that they work. You know, we all have different ways of learning and so on. Writing might not be your thing. I've suggested to people in the past, and it's worked for quite a few people, doing things like photos. For instance, most of us have phones with cameras in them nowadays. And what we can do with these is that either the photos we already have there, or even photos we then take during the day or whenever. The ones that mean something to us, the ones that we can feel something positive about a win, some form of gratitude, put them into a folder or an album. You can do that in most phones. And when I say the ones we feel positive or something about, it's not that we can look at it and go, this is an award-winning photo. What I'm talking about is we can look at it and go, I can see the people in that and I'm grateful for those people. Or I feel a win because I achieved such and such. Even if it's something like you painted the door or something, take a photo of the door and recognize that as a win. Recognize that as something you have done, you have completed. All the little things, it doesn't matter how big, it doesn't matter how small, collect them, because you can go back over them and re-feel the positivity of achieving that. And this is that there's two ways of this working. One is that at the time we feel the positivity and the success, and that helps build us so that we more naturally feel and recognize that positivity and success in ourselves, which means we're more likely to show self-kindness, self-compassion, self-love. There's that, but there's also the times when we're feeling a bit down and we can go back into that journal and we can reflect on what we've achieved or what the wins are, what we can be grateful for. It can give us a boost. So it's like going back and getting re-energized from something that happened in the past. And it's not just photos. We can, if you prefer to draw, then draw. If you prefer to write poetry about it, write songs about it, or whatever way you feel of recognizing it for yourself, then use that. There are guidelines on how to do these things, but it doesn't mean to say the rules aren't written in stone. It's what you need, what you can get out of it. So, in starting to sum up, there are a couple of books if you're interested in reading more on this topic about self-kindness and self-love and self-compassion. The first is Shiru Azadi's The Kindness Method. It comes or starts from a background of changing behaviour, changing habits connected with addiction, whether it be drinking or drugs or eating or so on. But there's a whole load of exercises and tools in that book that helps us get a bit more kindness towards ourselves and a bit more compassion towards ourselves. If you're looking for something more to do with self-compassion, then that's a fantastic book. There's a series of books, but the one that I recommend to a number of people is the Mindful Self-Compassion Workbook by Kristen Neff and Christopher Germa. Hope I've got those names right. And that helps a lot of people. It's a nice, gentle way of getting into self-compassion, because self-compassion can be a really difficult thing to deal with. There's a number of ways that they're looking at it. There's three main ways. One is about self-kindness over self-judgment, community and humanity over isolation. And again, that's a big thing when it comes to well-being, is that connection as opposed to isolation. And the other one is mindfulness over identification. That's where we're starting to recognize what's happening to us and be aware of that negative self-talk, if you like, rather than really tuning into it and feeling it spiraling and being overwhelmed by it. So that's us for another video. Hopefully you get some from it. Remember that it can be difficult to show that sort of self-love and self-compassion, but it's so worth making the attempt to do it. And sometimes we don't even realise that we're not showing it to ourselves. Sometimes we think we are. But that bit of reflection, that bit of journaling to become more aware of where we are and what we're doing can be so helpful. So have a go at that. Let me know, whether in the comments or messaging me, what sort of topics you would like me to cover going forward in the future. I've got a few ideas, but I'd love to know the sort of things that you want me to cover as well. Anyway, thanks very much again for all the views. The last video went and got fantastic views. Thank you very much for that. Again, for the subscriptions and the messages and the support. It's absolutely brilliant and well appreciated. Thanks a lot. If you feel like anybody who's watching us who hasn't subscribed, liked and what have you, all that YouTubey thing, feel free to subscribe and like the video if you can. That'd be brilliant. Anyway, see you next week. Thanks a lot. Bye.